December 1991. A cold winter night in a small town in Northern California. Scarlett Carter, 19 years old, a sophomore at UC Davis, had come home for the weekend. At 9:20 p.m., she stepped outside wearing her red coat. Beside her was Buddy, the family's golden retriever. A neighbor saw her walking toward the riverside park, leash in hand. Nothing about that moment seemed unusual. But not long after, people nearby heard a dog barking fiercely. Some said it sounded frantic, mixed with a strange noise in the distance. Then silence. By 11 p.m., Scarlett had not returned. Her parents tried calling her dorm, hoping she had gone back early, but no one answered. They searched the streets through the night, driving the familiar roads, calling her name. There was no trace of her or the dog. The last confirmed sighting of Scarlett was on the dim path along the riverbank. After that, the town fell quiet, unaware that one of its own had vanished. From a late-night walk with her dog to a disappearance that would haunt the community for decades, the question remains: what happened in those missing hours? Was it a chance encounter? An accident near the river? Or something far darker, hidden in the silence of that winter night? In the next chapter, we'll look at who Scarlett was, her life, her routine, and why her disappearance shook a place that once felt safe. Share your thoughts below. What do you think happened after 9:20 that night? Scarlett Carter was 19 years old, a sophomore at UC Davis, studying biology. She was the youngest child of the Carter family, raised in a quiet town in Northern California. Her parents still lived there, and every weekend she came home. She carried her books, sometimes small research samples, and spent her free time between the rhythms of college and the comfort of home. People who knew her described her in the same way: careful, steady, never reckless. Professors called her precise. Friends called her loyal. Neighbors said she was always polite, always willing to help. Scarlett didn't stand out as someone who chased danger. She followed routines, lived within familiar patterns. One of those patterns was Buddy, her golden retriever. He was 3 years old, large, loyal, and inseparable from Scarlett. When she went home, Buddy was always by her side. Neighbors often joked, "You see Scarlett, you see Buddy. They don't walk apart." It was more than a habit. It was their identity in that small town. Scarlett and Buddy together on the sidewalks, near the park, by the river path. Scarlett didn't spend much time at parties or late nights. At UC Davis, she lived in the dorms, studied biology with focus, and made plans for field research. She wanted to work on ecosystems, water and river life. Her friends said she often skipped weekend events on campus just to go home, walk Buddy, and spend time with her parents. She wasn't the type to disappear into the noise of college life. The town where she grew up wasn't large. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized everyone else. Population small, crime almost non-existent. People often left doors unlocked in the daytime. They trusted the safety of routine. A missing person wasn't just rare, it was unthinkable. Which is why, when Scarlett vanished, the shock was deeper than words. Her parents, Richard and Linda Carter, were known and respected. Richard had worked as an electrical engineer before retiring early. Linda taught elementary school, remembered by generations of local children. They were quiet, kind people with no conflicts in the community. Scarlett's older brother, Matthew. Scarlett's habits added to the confusion later. She never wandered far. She didn't stay out late. She didn't take risks. She stayed near the park, near the river, close enough to home that her parents never worried about danger. On that December night, she was only doing what she had done dozens of times before. That was what made her disappearance impossible to explain. Neighbors were quick to say she wasn't the kind of young woman who would walk away on her own. She wasn't restless, wasn't planning to run. When the news spread that Scarlett and Buddy hadn't returned, people refused to believe it was voluntary. They said, something happened. They said, someone else was there. The town felt the rupture immediately. This wasn't Los Angeles or San Francisco. It was a quiet California town, far from the stories of crime that filled newspapers elsewhere. Families who once let their children ride bikes after dark began to call them inside before nightfall. People who once left doors unlocked started checking them twice. Overnight, safety became a question. The image of Scarlett and Buddy walking under the winter sky stayed fixed in memory. The leash in her hand, the red coat in the cold, the sound of paws on the frozen ground. It was a routine night, until it wasn't. And because she was a familiar face, a careful student, a neighbor everyone knew, the shock spread faster. Her disappearance didn't just break a family. It unsettled the entire town. Rumors spread, theories grew. But in the beginning, all people had were fragments. A walk that started as usual. A red coat. A leash. A river path. And silence. The ordinary details of Scarlett's life became the core of the investigation. Because investigators would later say, when someone like Scarlett disappears, without warning, without motive, without chance to explain, it almost always means one thing. Someone else intervened, and that's where the story turns. Because the question that lingered in every conversation, in every candlelight vigil, in every headline was simple. If Scarlett didn't leave by choice, then who crossed paths with her that night? As we move forward, we will... Around 9:40 p.m., another resident, George Miller, was fishing near the banks. He later reported hearing Buddy barking furiously. He described the sound as frantic, not the kind of bark a dog makes at passing footsteps. He also heard what he called a sudden commotion, a brief struggle, then silence. He did not see anything in the darkness, only the echo of the dog's cries fading into the night. After that moment, Scarlett never returned. The street stayed quiet. The park appeared still, covered in thin layers of snow that had fallen earlier in the day. Nothing seemed out of place, yet something irreversible had already happened. At 10 p.m., a local police patrol car rolled through the area. The officer glanced at the park as he passed. He saw nothing unusual, just the outlines of trees and the dim light of a street lamp. No one raised an alarm at that point. To him, it was just another winter evening. Back at the Carter home, time kept moving. By 11 p.m., Scarlett's parents were growing uneasy. It wasn't like her to stay out that long on a cold night. She usually took short walks with Buddy and came home before it got too late. They began calling her dorm at UC Davis, even though they knew she had come home for the weekend. They tried friends, relatives, anyone who might know where she had gone. Every call came back empty. As the clock moved closer to midnight, the mood shifted from worry to fear. The park remained empty. The streets were silent. Only the faint sound of the river moving under the thin ice broke the silence. Scarlett and Buddy were nowhere to be seen. By then, the entire situation had changed. What began as a delay, a daughter coming home later than expected, had turned into a disappearance. There were no phone calls, no sightings, no explanations. Just the silence of a missing girl and her dog. For the Carters, those hours felt endless. Richard Carter, Scarlett's father, walked the neighborhood streets with a flashlight. He called her name, hoping she had simply lost track of time. Linda Carter waited by the phone. By morning, the questions would multiply. What had caused Buddy's frantic barking? Who, if anyone, was near Scarlett between 9:20 and 9:40? And why was there no trace of her when the patrol car passed through just minutes later? The town would wake up to a story that made no sense. A young woman and her loyal dog had disappeared from a familiar road. The first fragments of evidence were still waiting to be found in the snow. And as daylight came, investigators would soon discover that the final walk Scarlett took had left behind more than silence. It had left behind clues, footprints, fabric, and a trail that would lead directly into the heart of the mystery. Sunday breaks cold and gray over the small town. Scarlett has not come home. Her coat is red, her route is short, her pattern is steady. None of that fits an all-night absence. The Carters call the police before most people have brewed coffee. Dispatch marks it high risk, a 19-year-old, a winter night, a riverside park, and a routine that never stretches past an hour. Patrol units roll to the Carter home and to the park. An officer logs the time, the weather, the temperature, and the last known direction of travel. He notes the narrow footpath under cottonwoods, the street lamp with a blown bulb, and the thin crust of snow that fell after midnight. A second unit canvasses the nearest blocks, knocking on doors, asking for anything from 9:15 to 10:30. A clipboard fills with names and phone numbers. A map of the park goes onto the hood of a cruiser and gets weighed down with a radio. By mid-morning, the search widens. A supervisor calls in a canine team. The handler shows Buddy's brush and Scarlett's spare sweater to the dog, then brings the nose down to the sidewalk in front of the Carter house. The dog pulls toward the river. Volunteers gather on the curb. Neighbors, a mail carrier off shift, a teacher from the elementary school. An officer lines them up 2 arm spans apart and explains how to sweep a field without trampling evidence. Keep your eyes low. Don't pick anything up. Call out what you see. Above them, a helicopter thumps the air and slides along the river. An officer kneels to photograph the prints with a ruler in frame. He circles each group with flags. The larger prints overlap Scarlett's, near the bend where the trail narrows between the fence and the water. At the bend, the pattern breaks. The snow is raked, the outlines smudged, and the surface shows a shallow groove that runs 3 feet toward the riverbank. Someone calls out from the grass, "Red fabric." A scarf, damp and cold, snagged in low reeds. The tag carries the Carter family's laundry mark. The radio snaps. The perimeter tightens. They tape off the trail from the footbridge to the north gate. A detective arrives with paper bags, labels, and a camera. He orders wide shots first, then mid-range, then close. Volunteers are steered to the outer ring of the park. A line of yellow tape moves with them. The scene is quiet except for boots on snow and the helicopter fading in the distance. A notepad fills with measurements. Distance from scarf to footpath, from groove to waterline, from the nearest lamppost to the bend. Detectives canvass again with fresh questions. Did anyone see a red coat after 9:20? Did anyone hear shouting, a horn, a door slam? A fisherman who walks the river most nights says he heard a dog bark hard at 9:40 and something that sounded like a stumble. He did not see anyone. He did not think to call. His statement goes into the file. Marine units launch a small aluminum boat and idle along the near bank, probing with hooks for clothing or a purse. The river is winter cold, dark and slow under a thin skin of broken ice along the edges. Nothing rises. Nothing catches. They mark drifts and eddies on a chart in case they need to come back with divers. A second canine circles the park loop and alerts twice near the bend, then loses the scent at the water's edge. As daylight fades, the command post lights snap on. A portable heater hums under a canopy. Coffee arrives in cardboard carriers. The town keeps showing up. People bring flashlights, hand warmers, and stories of walking that trail for years. Officers thank them, sign them in, and send them in. Back at the Carter house, officers walk through with gloves and evidence bags. They collect a hairbrush, a toothbrush, and a spare scarf for scent and potential comparison. They photograph the hallway where Scarlett hung her jacket earlier in the day. Richard Carter signs a consent form, his pen heavy, his face still. Linda sits at the table with a list of friends and calls the dorm at UC Davis again. No answer. A detective takes notes on a legal pad. Last conversation time. Last meal. The exact route Buddy prefers. Whether Scarlett ever cut through the parking lot behind the library to shorten the loop. As night falls again, the park is a grid. Reflective tape on volunteer jackets flashes in headlamps. They fan along the fence line, then the baseball diamond, then the path to the boathouse. One volunteer spots a drag mark in a patch where the snow thinned, 2 faint parallel lines. But the detective decides it's from a trash bin rolled earlier in the day. Another finds a glove that turns out to be a child's, wet and lost for weeks. Each false lead is logged and bagged. Nothing connects. Nothing brings Scarlett home. The tone in town shifts. Parents call their kids in before dark. Porch lights burn. The hardware store sells out of deadbolts by closing. Someone posts flyers at the gas station. A red-coated silhouette. A time window. A phone number. A few men talk about a stranger they saw in a blue pickup earlier in the week. The plate is partial. The lead is thin. It goes into the stack anyway. At the command post, detectives sketch the scene on a large pad. The footbridge at the top, the bend at center, the scarf at the reeds. They mark the overlapping prints and the groove toward the water. The picture is clear enough to change the language. This no longer reads like a voluntary departure. The scarf is not an accident. The mixed footprints do not lie. The file leaves the missing person box and enters the major case slot. A press release mentions concerning indicators and asks for dashcam footage from anyone who drove Riverside Road between the hours stretch. Officers rotate. Volunteers head home and promise to return with coffee at dawn. The river darkens. The park empties to a ring of flashing reds and blues at its edge. Inside the tape, it's quiet again. You can hear the river move and the soft crack of ice against roots. By Monday morning, the search resumes as if the night never fell. More volunteers, more doors knocked. The county sends a second helicopter and a thermal drone from a neighboring jurisdiction, though the tech is new and limited. A dive plan is laid out with sectors, depths, and hazards. The detective phones the university to confirm class schedules and to pull a list of Scarlett's lab partners, in case she made plans no one at home knew about. A patrol car drives the length of Riverside Road at idle speed, looking at ditch lines for tire ruts that might match a struggle, a stop, a turn. Still, No sign of Scarlett. No leash, no purse, no wallet. Just the red scarf, the mixed prints, and the shallow mark toward the water. The town moves from shock to resolve. The search radius expands by blocks and then by miles. Calls come in from people who think they saw a red coat near the bus depot, a blonde student at the diner, a girl with a golden dog near a hardware store days earlier. Each report is logged, each is checked. None holds. And then comes the note that will change the tone again. 3 days after Scarlett vanished, a patrol unit downriver follows a report of something on the shore. It is Buddy. The dog is still, cold, and found near a tangle of driftwood. The discovery hits the command post like a new weather front. The river may be part of the story. The river may hold more. Before that next turn, this is where we stop. The first wave of the search has drawn the map. A red scarf, overlapping prints, and a trail that ends at the waterline. The town has moved from hope to fear. The case has moved from missing to suspicious, and a single discovery waits to push it further. As we move forward, we'll confront what the river gave back. The sight confirmed what many feared. Buddy had been dead for several days. The body was stiff from the cold, but the most chilling detail was around the neck. The collar bore deep impressions of force, the unmistakable mark of a tightened rope or chain. This was not an accident. It was not a fall into the river. Someone had deliberately silenced the dog. For the town, this was the moment fear overcame hope. Until then, people clung to the possibility that Scarlett had gotten lost, had gone somewhere unexpected, or even chosen to leave for reasons unknown. But Buddy's death destroyed those theories. If the dog had been killed, then Scarlett's disappearance could no longer be treated as a case of a missing young woman. It was now evidence of violence. Whispers spread instantly. Parents told their children not to leave the house after dark. Neighbors closed their doors earlier than usual. The town that once prided itself on safety began to treat every shadow as a threat. At the local school, students spoke of little else. At the market, shoppers lowered their voices but repeated the same question. If Buddy was dead, what had happened to Scarlett? The headlines came quickly. Local papers ran bold titles across the front page. Dog of missing student found dead by river. The radio repeated the story on every update. What was once described as the strange case of a missing college student now became a suspected act of violence. The shift in tone was clear. Investigators recognized this as the turning point. Until then, the file was marked as a high-risk disappearance. But with the discovery of Buddy's body, it was upgraded. This was now treated as a potential homicide. The search was no longer just about finding Scarlett alive. It was about uncovering what had been done to her. The earlier pieces of evidence suddenly carried new weight. The footprints found in the snow, one set matching Scarlett's small boots, another larger pair that could not be identified, were now considered vital. The faint drag marks leading toward the river were re-examined, photographed, and compared against the scene where Buddy was found. The red scarf, damp and wrinkled, collected from the grass. The impact on the town was immediate. Rumors about a stranger lurking near the park grew louder. Some claimed to have seen a man's figure days before standing near the path. Others swore they heard unfamiliar footsteps in the area that night. Whether these accounts were accurate or not, the sense of dread was real. People avoided the riverside after dark. Shops closed earlier. Patrol cars circled more frequently, their headlights cutting through empty streets. The law was clear. Buddy's death was a criminal act. By definition, the case could no longer be filed under voluntary disappearance. The sheriff's office announced that they were officially investigating a violent crime. Resources from the county were pulled in. Detectives began to revisit every possible suspect, pulling records of anyone with a history of aggression, anyone known to wander the area late at night. That same night, the community held a candlelight vigil at the entrance of the Riverside Park. Neighbors brought flowers. Friends of Scarlett printed her photo and placed it next to Buddy's collar. The image of the young student in her red coat, smiling with her dog at her side, contrasted sharply with the reality that unfolded. The vigil was silent except for prayers whispered into the cold air. For investigators, Buddy's discovery was both a confirmation and a challenge. It proved beyond doubt that a crime had occurred, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who had the strength and intent to strangle a dog? Was Buddy silenced because he had fought back, barked, or tried to protect Scarlett? Did the attacker target Scarlett randomly, or was there a connection hidden beneath the surface of this quiet town? The investigation shifted gears. Detectives began mapping Scarlett's final walk in even greater detail. They revisited every witness, asking about suspicious noises, figures, or vehicles in the area. The fisherman who found Buddy was questioned carefully, though he was quickly cleared. His discovery was a chance event, not involvement. The evidence collected so far was thin but troubling. Footprints, drag marks, a scarf, and now a dead dog. No direct sighting of the attacker. No body of the missing student. Yet for detectives, this combination of But this was not the end of the investigation. Detectives had to push forward. With Scarlett gone and Buddy silenced, the town waited for the next step, for the first real suspect to emerge. The case shifts the moment Buddy is found. The file is reclassified. This is no longer a high-risk disappearance. It is a criminal investigation. Detective Harold Grant takes command. He starts with a clean board, a tight timeline, and a list of tasks that have to be done now, not later. He locks down the park and the blocks around it. He assigns 2 teams to the river corridor and a third to the residential grid where Scarlett's family lives. He wants every door knocked, every porch camera checked, every night shift worker asked what they saw on their breaks. Patrol logs are pulled. Dispatch recordings are reviewed for calls near the time window. The route Scarlett walked is measured in yards, hazards, and sight lines. Where the path narrows, he notes where a person could be surprised. Where the street light is out, he notes how darkness helps a stranger. He forwards the red scarf to evidence with a priority tag. The chain of custody form gets a case number, his signature, and the time to the minute. The scarf is dried, packaged, and sealed. He sends the unknown hair recovered from Scarlett's coat to cold storage with a memo. Hold for future DNA comparison. In 1991, the lab can't do much with a single hair shaft. He knows it. He preserves it anyway. The shoeprint tracings taken at the bend, large, male, athletic tread, are pressed onto graph paper. An evidence tech sketches the block pattern by hand and lists brand candidates. It's a common sole. It could be anyone. Still, it's something that can be matched later if luck turns. Grant rebuilds the last hours from scratch. He interviews Helen Brooks again, this time walking with her from her front step to the spot where she last saw Scarlett at 9:20 p.m. He times the walk on a cheap wristwatch. He notes how far a voice would carry on a cold night. He marks where a person on the trail would be seen from the street and where a fence or brush would hide them. He speaks to the fisherman who reported animal noise near 9:40. He has the man stand where he stood. He listens for the Carter home becomes a secondary scene, not because it's suspicious, but because habit lives there. Grant asks about Scarlett's standard route. Does she ever cut through the library lot to shorten the loop? Does she ever switch the route when it's icy? Which side of the path does Buddy heel on? He collects a path map the family drew for a neighbor months earlier when they dog-sat. He pulls Scarlett's class schedule and calls UC Davis for lab partner names and any notes about late-night study plans. He doesn't find a secret plan or a sudden reason to vanish. Every line points back to the same quiet loop along the river. With violent crime now on the table, Grant orders a suspect canvass. He starts with men known to hang around the park at odd hours. That list is short in a small town, but it exists. A grounds worker who drinks after hours, a drifter who sleeps under the footbridge, a resident with a domestic complaint 2 months earlier. Each is interviewed. Each story is checked for time and place. One by one, they don't break. Then there's Douglas Doug Harris, 20 Expedition, who lives 3 kilometers from the park and has a record for assault. Grant brings him in. The interview room is plain. Harris sits with his hands flat. He says he was home watching television. He has no one to confirm it. He denies being at the park that night. He says he doesn't know Scarlett. Grant looks for injuries, scratches, defensive marks, dog bites. He sees none. He asks about shoes. Harris says he owns 2 pairs of sneakers, both common brands. Officers collect them with a property receipt. The soles are compared to the hand-sketched pattern from the trail. The lines don't rule him in, and they don't rule him out. It's not enough for a warrant. It's not enough for an arrest. Harris walks. The name stays on the board. Grant pushes the lab as far as 1991 will allow. The scarf is examined for fibers, soil, and any trace that could tie to a car, a carpet, or a building. A faint mix of river silt and lawn clippings shows up. Nothing unique. The hair from Scarlett's coat is examined under a microscope. It's human. It's not dyed. There's no root. That means no nuclear DNA test. The best the state... He authorizes a neighborhood vehicle canvass for the date in question. Trucks parked curbside with mud patterns, vans with damaged bumpers. Any vehicle with interior pet hair that doesn't match the owner's dog. It's old-school, slow work. Officers log plates and talk to owners. One blue pickup with an out-of-county plate draws interest, but the owner is a contractor on a short job who left town the next day with a signed work order that checks out. Another lead collapses when a reported scream turns out to be a fox that screams like a person at night. Each false lead is documented, then crossed off. The college angle is checked. Did Scarlett have a stalking complaint on campus? Number. Did she have conflicts in her biology cohort? None reported. Did she put anything odd in a letter home? Her mother saved the last postcard. It talks about finals and a favorite professor. Nothing points to a plan to leave. Nothing points to a feud. Pressure builds. The press starts naming the case. The headline tone hardens. The Scarlett case runs in block letters. Reporters ask why no one is in custody. Grant answers with what he can share. The area searched, the items collected, the resources requested from the county. He does not talk about the larger shoeprint. He does not show the hair. He protects the parts that could be tested later. The family's pressure is different. Richard Carter asks for a wider radius. He's right. Grant expands the grid to include drainage ditches and private outbuildings with consent. Matthew, home on urgent leave, argues to re-interview the early suspect list and to set up checkpoints after dark. Grant adds evening patrols around the park and the roads that feed it. He logs all of it because the paper trail matters when a case is quiet and the public is loud. Mistakes still happen. A small scrap of fabric found near a maintenance shed gets bagged wet in a paper sack and mildews before the lab can test it. By the time it's dried and examined, it's useless. The report goes into the file. An officer mislabels a photo roll, and everyone loses a day sorting frames to the right scene markers. Grant calls a short briefing and the door-to-door work continues. Officers return to the same houses more than once because people remember details late when fear loosens tongues. A tenant now recalls a dog barking, then a car door, then tires on wet pavement, all in a quick row. The time could fit. The direction is toward Riverside Road. It is added to the map and weighed against other fragments. It still doesn't name a person. Grant requests a list of men cited for park curfew violations in the past year. He runs their names against domestic violence calls and bar fights. He gets a short cross list. He interviews them with patience and pressure. One breaks on a traffic warrant. One offers an alibi that checks out. The list shrinks, but not to one. As Christmas approaches, the investigation settles into a rhythm. Tips come in, are logged, and are chased. Some are malicious, most are well-intended, and a few are steady enough to check twice. Grant keeps his focus on the evidence that can be placed in a courtroom. The scarf, the shoeprint pattern, the hair, the documented time window, the physical geography of the bend. He pairs that with the reality of 1991. No national shoeprint database, limited DNA, no network of street cameras. What he can do, he does. What he can't, he preserves. By the end of the month, the immediate wave of leads has thinned. No one is arrested. No body is found. The file grows thicker with interviews, photographs, and maps. The board on the wall has fewer question marks, but the center remains open. Grant does what experienced detectives do when a case resists. He writes a plan for the long haul. He flags items for retesting when technology improves. He keeps the hair sealed and the scarf stored in climate control. He lists persons of interest with reasons they rose and why they didn't hold. He marks Doug Harris as the one to watch if he reoffends. The town slows, but the investigation doesn't end. It shifts into a lower gear, quieter, methodical, and relentless in its own way. Patrol officers. The Scarlett Carter case slowly slipped into silence. By the late 1990s, investigators had no body, no clear suspect, and no decisive evidence. The file was officially reclassified as a cold case. Detective Harold Grant, who had led the first phase of the investigation, made sure every piece of evidence was preserved. The red scarf, the unidentified strand of hair, and the detailed sketch of the large shoe prints were sealed and labeled. In his notes, he underlined a single reminder: these must be retested when DNA technology advanced. For the town, life changed. Families who once left doors unlocked began keeping them bolted. Parents picked up their children before dusk. The riverside path, once busy with evening joggers, grew empty after 8 p.m. What was once a symbol of peace became a place no one wanted to walk. Rumors filled the gap left by the lack of progress. People whispered about a stranger standing near the river, about a blue pickup parked by the trail, about the sound of a car door slamming around 9:40 p.m. None of it could be verified. The stories multiplied, but none brought answers. Each December, the case resurfaced in the press. The local paper ran anniversary features with timelines, photos, and appeals for new witnesses. Reporters reminded readers of the scarf in the reeds, the drag marks in the snow, and Buddy's death. They asked if anyone had remembered something new. But year after year, no breakthrough came. The Carter family kept Scarlett's memory alive. Every winter they organized a candlelight vigil at the entrance of the park. Neighbors gathered with flowers, photos, and prayers. At the center of each vigil was Scarlett's portrait, placed beside Buddy's collar. The image became part of the town's identity, a reminder of both loss and persistence. Police did not stop receiving calls, but most were false leads. Someone claimed to have seen a red coat at the bus depot. Another swore they heard a scream on a different night. Each tip was checked, logged, and dismissed. Nothing solid ever emerged. At UC Davis, Scarlett's classmates organized small memorials. Through all of it, unanswered questions haunted both investigators and the community. Why did the tracks show a clear drag mark toward the river, but no body was ever recovered? Why did the larger set of prints overlap Scarlett's and then vanish? These mysteries fed speculation and fear, but not resolution. By the end of the decade, hope had thinned. Yet the preserved evidence and the unanswered questions kept the file open, waiting for the day when science might provide what memory and witness accounts could not. 24 winters pass before the file stirs again. It is 2015 in California when patrol officers book a man on a violent assault. The arrest itself is routine. The name is not. Douglas Doug Harris, the same man Detective Harold Grant circled in pencil back in 1991, then had to let go because the evidence stopped short. A clerk flags the match. A supervisor calls the cold case unit. The folder marked Scarlett Carter comes down from a shelf. Sheriffs pull the old inventory. The red scarf sealed in paper. The graph paper sketch of a large tread. The plaster cast of a print taken at the river bend. And the single, light brown hair taken from the lining of Scarlett's coat. Grant's notes run down the margins. Preserve, label, retest when technology allows. That day has arrived. The lab starts with what time could not erase. The shoeprint. In 1991, they drew it block by block and poured plaster into the cleanest impression near the bend where the trail narrows. The pattern showed wide lugs, a diagonal bar across the heel, and a chipped corner on one outer block. An imperfection that became a fingerprint of its own. In 2015, technicians photograph the cast at high resolution and compare the measurements against the shoes seized from Harris during the new arrest, and against photos of shoes he owned in the early 90s, captured in an old booking photo and a storage room box from a prior case. The diagonal bar matches. The lug spacing matches. The chipped corner, unbelievably, matches. The probability of coincidence narrows to a sliver. Next, the hair. In 1991, the strand was treated like something that might matter someday and then sealed away. No nuclear DNA profile could be made then. In 2015, mitochondrial analysis and improved extraction let the lab develop a full profile and, with a fresh reference from Harris, confirm a match. The chain of custody is airtight. Initial recovery note, date, time, collector's signature, freezer logs, transfers, and seals unbroken. The report lands on a detective's desk with 4 words underlined in blue. Consistent with Harris. One by one, the old fragments gain weight. The mixed footprints in the snow. the faint drag toward the water. The scarf snagged in reeds. The dog found days later. Each piece had lived in a world of maybe. The new science pulls them across the line. The district attorney agrees to file. The charge is framed around the disappearance and the violent acts inferred at the scene. A warrant issues. Harris is moved from county custody on the new arrest and booked again under Scarlett's case. The sheriff's office schedules a press conference. They choose a simple message and stick to it. After more than 20 years, they say, the investigation into the disappearance of Scarlett Carter has identified a suspect. The Carters receive the call privately before the press release goes out. Richard answers. Linda sits beside him and writes down each sentence. The detective reads carefully. He explains what the lab found, what the records show, what will happen next. The line goes quiet. Then Richard says thank you, and the words feel too small. They meet at the station that afternoon. In a conference room, Grant sets the old plaster cast on the table next to the new lab reports. He tells them he kept these items for years because he believed they would speak when science caught up. He does not promise more than the case can give. He does not say they will find Scarlett. He says only that accountability is now possible. Booking photos of Harris from 1991 and 2015 appear side by side on slides at the arraignment. In the first, a young face with a set jaw. In the second, a face gone heavier but not softer. He pleads not guilty. His attorney challenges the age of the evidence, the continuity of the chain of custody, and the reliability of footprint comparisons. The state responds with methodical testimony. A veteran tech walks the jury through the plaster cast, the measuring protocol, the graph paper record, and the way that chipping on the lug cannot be recreated by chance. A DNA analyst explains extraction steps, contamination controls, and why a single hair can still tie a person to a garment when the chain of custody is clean. Witnesses from the original file return to a stand they never expected to see again. Helen Brooks repeats what she saw at 9:20 p.m. A red coat, a leash, a direction toward the park. George Miller repeats what he heard at 9:40. A dog barking hard, a quick scramble, then quiet. No one embellishes. The prosecutor keeps the rhythm short and plain. This is the path. These are the marks. Here is the scarf. Here is the cast. Here is the hair. And here, finally, the person whose shoes and DNA meet those marks. The defense tries to make the footprints general. Lots of shoes look alike, they say. The expert stays on the single-chipped lug and the exact spacing. The defense tries to make the hair uncertain. Transfer, they argue. Coincidence, they suggest. The chain of custody log and the clean lab report hold. The jurors take notes. They ask for the plaster cast during deliberation. They run fingers along the rough edge and the missing corner. They read the DNA summary again. Outside the courtroom, the town is quiet. No rallies, no shouting. Just the steady presence of neighbors who have carried this story for decades. A few people who once swore the river took everything now say the river took a life and kept a secret. Others who blamed outsiders accept that the danger lived among them. The school places a small framed photo of Scarlett on a shelf near the library sign-out desk. At the park, the old lamppost with the blown bulb, replaced years ago, casts a wide circle of light. In the end, the verdict arrives without drama. Guilty. The judge issues a life sentence without parole. The words are simple and final. Harris turns slightly in his chair but does not look back. Richard and Linda hold hands and stay seated long after the courtroom empties. Matthew stands behind them, one hand on each shoulder. No one speaks. There is no victory here, only an answer. When reporters ask the Carters for comment on the courthouse steps, Richard says what he practiced at the kitchen table. We do not get our daughter back, but we have learned who is responsible for her disappearance. He thanks Detective Grant for saving the evidence, thanks the lab for making it speak, and thanks the town for the years of showing up with candles, flyers, and quiet help. The case now becomes a lesson. In police trainings, the story is used to teach chain of custody, why paper bags matter, why signatures matter, why a cast poured in snow can find its purpose decades later. In forensic classrooms, students study the photos of the tread and the chipped lug. In DNA courses, they trace the arc from limited testing in the early 90s to robust profiling in the 2000s. The message is steady. Preserve everything that might someday become the hinge. Back at the park, a stone bench appears near the bend. A small plaque carries a name and 2 dates with no closing date. Students from UC Davis drive up and sit there before finals, some to think, some to promise themselves they will work harder in labs like the ones that solved this case. Each December, the town gathers at the entrance with candles again. The vigil feels different now. The fear has eased. The loss remains. One question stays on the table and must be said out loud. Scarlett has not been found. The river gave back the dog and nothing else. The investigation keeps a standing tasking order to follow any report of remains along that stretch or beyond. Land searches resume when drought lowers water or construction exposes old ground. Nothing credible has surfaced. The Carters accept the limits of what the law can do and hope for a discovery that might allow a burial. Even with that absence, the turn in 2015 marks the first true shift of power in this story. From a night of silence to a record with names, methods, and proof. A footprint cast by flashlight, a hair sealed in a freezer, a detective's margin note asking the future for help. Put together, they did what brute searching could not. They built a bridge back to the truth. That is the step this chapter brings. Not closure, but clarity. The town can say who walked into the park that night and who walked out. The family can speak their daughter's name without a question mark at the end. And the case file, once a thin bundle of guesses, now holds a verdict stamped in black ink. The trial ended with no more delays, no more appeals to wait for. Douglas Doug Harris, once questioned and released in 1991, was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. In the courtroom, the words landed heavy. Family members embraced. Reporters scribbled their notes. Cameras clicked once, then went silent. After 24 years, the case had reached its legal conclusion. But the ending was not simple. Scarlett Carter was still missing. No remains had ever been recovered, no grave ever marked. Richard Carter, Scarlett's father, stood outside the courthouse that day and told reporters, "We lost our daughter forever." A memorial was built near the entrance of the Riverside Park. A simple stone bench bore the name Scarlett Carter. Friends left flowers there, while strangers left candles and written prayers. Every December, on the anniversary of her disappearance, townspeople gathered at the site. They placed Scarlett's photograph next to Buddy's old collar. Some bowed their heads in silence, others held hands. The vigil became part of the rhythm of the town's winter. At UC Davis, where Scarlett had once studied biology, a scholarship was created in her name. Each year, one student received the award to continue studies in the field she loved. For the university, it was more than financial aid. It was a reminder of a student whose life had been cut short, and whose story carried lessons beyond textbooks. The case also reshaped the way investigators approached unsolved crimes. Law enforcement agencies across California cited the Scarlett case as an example of why every scrap of evidence should be preserved. The scarf, the sketch of a shoe print, the sealed hair sample, items that once looked inconclusive turned into the cornerstone of conviction. Detective Harold Grant, retired by the time of the trial, told a journalist, "We didn't have the tools then, but I knew the day would come. That's why I kept pushing to hold on to it all." For true crime researchers and law students, the case became a standard example in lectures. Professors highlighted how advances in forensic science could reopen doors that once seemed locked. The importance of patience, evidence management, and persistence was hammered home by the outcome of this trial. The town, however, still carried scars. For over 20 years, rumors had circulated about a man in a blue pickup, about strange noises near the river, about unfamiliar faces at the bar. The verdict showed that the danger had not been a shadow or a rumor, but a real man living just 3 kilometers from the park. People looked back with a mix of anger and guilt. They had lived alongside a killer without knowing. Even after the verdict, unanswered questions remained. Where was Scarlett? Did Harris dispose of her body in the river that night? The story of Scarlett Carter lives on as more than a single crime. It became a warning, a lesson, and a legacy. A warning about trust in small towns. A lesson about the patience required in investigations. A legacy of a young woman whose name would not be forgotten, even without a grave. In the words carved on her memorial bench, "Justice may be delayed, but truth will not disappear." What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was truly served, even without finding Scarlett? Share your thoughts, theories, or memories if you lived through cases like this. Your perspective might help us reflect on the weight of time, justice, and truth.